بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. I get to dip in and out of quite a variety of Muslim communities, and I always think it's one of the strengths of Islam in the West that we have so many bands of the Muslim spectrum available to us. But one thing that I've noticed that most communities have in common now, that certainly Muslims of earlier, more peaceful generations would have regarded as a serious worry, is that people are in a state of agitation. When I became Muslim 21 years ago, one of the things that attracted me and held my attention was the peacefulness, serenity and acceptance of ordinary Muslims. That you would step into a mosque for Jummah prayer and there was a genuine sense that this was an oasis of tranquility, serenity and calm that was a welcome, indeed essential place of rest from the agitations and stresses of people's ordinary lives outside. And although many things have certainly improved for Islam in the West over those 20 years, the thing that I've noticed most conspicuously has been that people are starting to lose that beautiful criterion of Muslimness that is known in the Quranic vocabulary as the virtue of rida. Rida means tranquil, serene acceptance of Allah's will. And it's alarming, I think, that Muslims should feel so agitated, disturbed by the state of today's world. Not that they should approve of today's world. In fact, it would be a worrying indictment of the legitimacy of the religion if the modern world outside were to approve of us. We complain about negative stereotypes and hostility, but in fact that's always been the way of the believers against the uncomprehending outside world. That, in a sense, is a sign of our legitimacy, not something that we should worry and campaign against, although obviously false information has to be corrected. And those religions that are approved of and patted on the head by secular, consumerist, capitalistic modernity are by that very same token really interrogated in a source of worry from the point of view of a legitimate traditional perspective, because true religion is about akhirah, it's about transcending the self, it's not about gratifying or discovering the self, which is the watchword of today's world. So we should be proud that the modern world doesn't like us. That's a sign of authenticity. Nonetheless, it's also the case that Muslims, when they view this incomprehension or hostility from the outside world, don't find solace in the traditional virtue of rida in the way that often we did. We find forms of agitation, we find insecurity, and the necessary consequence of that, which is that instead of being so relaxed that we're forgiving and inclusive and we see the best in everybody, we increasingly judge because the slightest difference between ourselves and the doctrine or the practice of another Muslim somehow makes us feel even more insecure. We want the religion to be an oasis of monolithic consistency that gratifies our sense of insecurity. Now that's very dangerous for communities because the religion itself is supposed to provide a sense of absolute constant assurance and relaxation and serenity that everything that happens is by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is at the core of the Quranic message. It's a necessary consequence of Tawheed that Allah is not just the one who winds up the cosmic clock at the beginning of creation like an 18th century deistic God and just lets it happen. So we have to be profoundly agitated by the vicissitudes of time. Allah is the one who is not just Al-Khaliq but Al-Khallaq. He is the one who is constantly creating. At every moment there is nothing that is not the direct consequence of the divine power. وَالْقَاهِرُ فَوْقَ عِبَادِهِ. He is the one who is overwhelmingly powerful over the actions of his slaves. وَمَا رَمَيْتَ إِذْ رَمَيْتَ وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ رَمَى. You did not throw, or you did not shoot the arrows when you shot the arrows, but it was Allah who did that. And this is one of the reasons for the extraordinary solidity of Islamic theology, that we don't have a realm of the action of God and a realm that is the realm of some alternative dark force, a satanic force that almost is as powerful as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that the world is a cosmic battle between good and evil. We don't see it in those terms because the message of Tawheed, which is written throughout the Quran, is that there is just one agent in creation. Now, what raises us above just being part of the scenery, as it were, what really makes us human, is not, as some religions hold, suffering, but rather the ability to choose and thereby to affirm the divinely gifted miracle and paradox of autonomy. And this is what we refer to in our theology as kasb. Modern scientists increasingly point towards a very deterministic view of the cosmos, that we are all basically predictable, that our actions can all be deconstructed and interpreted in terms of our education, our upbringing, genetic factors, and there's very little scope left, it seems, for genuine human independence and hence humanity. But the miracle of Islamic religion is that on the one hand it affirms that Allah is ala kulli shay'in qadir, everything is in His hands, and on the other hand it genuinely considers us accountable and responsible for our own actions, so that at the moment when we authentically rise above our genetic programming, our education and everything else, and take a moral decision, a decision for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then we are stepping outside the mechanics of the universe and genuinely becoming Allah's Khalifa on earth. And that's the moment that we refer to as kasb. We don't create our own actions, there's only one creator. But in an instantaneous, miraculous fraction of a second, we can acquire actions. And this is from the mystery of the ruh, which is what sets us apart from the rest of creation. قُلِ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِّنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. They ask you about the ruh, the spirit. Say, the spirit is of the command of my Lord, or the affair of my Lord, and of knowledge you've been given but little. But we know that we all have that. وَنَفَخْنَا فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِنَا. Allah breathed something of His spirit into Sayyidina Adam alayhi salam. So that moment of kasb and of acquisition of actions is something that immediately sets us up above and beyond the world and makes us potentially Allah's khulafa. Now, this extraordinary awareness that we have of history as being the unfolding of Allah's knowledge, and we don't believe in a God who is in time. We have a timeless God, because past, present, future, they're all the same to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Everything is one single cosmic act, kun fayakun. That this attitude has historically bred amongst the Muslims a wonderful sense, first of all, of the necessity to act, because this is the prophetic way. وَقُولِ اعْمَلُوا, act, work. And on the other hand, a sense that everything that happens is good, because the purposes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are good. And this virtue of rida historically created Muslim communities whose visitors were always struck by the sense of contentment and serene, resigned acceptance of Allah's decree. And the fact that that's slipping away from us, even though so many other aspects of Islam may seem to be prominent or even coming back to us, is, I think, something that we need to think about. Because it's an impugning and a compromising of our tawheed to suggest that what's happening in today's world is not the direct will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sometimes we see in the world manifestations of the divine beauty and grace and forgiveness. And that's preponderant. Sometimes we see in the world manifestations of the divine rigor and wrath. And this is one of the big differences between our understanding and, say, the Christian understanding. Christians say, God is love, and immediately they can't explain the meningitis virus or concentration camps or whatever, and that's a major source of loss of faith amongst them. Now we say that Allah is indeed Rahman and Rahim, and He is Al-Wadud, He has those beautiful attributes, and they do predominate. And at the end, when good and evil are finally differentiated, we will see that the Rahmah predominates over the divine wrath. Nonetheless, we also believe that Allah is Al-Jabbar, the overwhelming, Al-Muntaqim, the avenger, the judge, Al-Hakam. And that's one reason why Islamic theology hangs together so well when confronted by the paradoxes of evil and suffering in the world, that we believe that the world is the endlessly subtle interaction of 99 names that include names of rigor as well as names of beauty. Which also means that the perfected human being, the Adamic human being, sometimes and predominantly manifests mercy and forgiveness, but sometimes can manifest rigor as well. Which is why the Prophet ﷺ forgave the people of Mecca, but he also went to war against them. Because he is the true Khalifa, he has those names, and he has within himself something of the Rahmah, and he has within himself also something of Al-Muntaqim, the Avenger. That the true representative of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on earth is not just the woolly-minded, kind, benevolent saint who always turns the other cheek, but sometimes has to uphold Allah's rule in the world through those names as well. And that's part of the completeness of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, that in him we can see manifested, insofar as is possible for created mortal human beings, all of the names of Allah, not just the names of beauty and the names of mercy. So we look at the world and we see, in some periods of Islamic history, divine providence, al-inaya, opening the floodgates of blessings to the Muslim ummah, invariably in proportion to the extent to which we deserve it. The Sahaba, everything they did and saw was miracles. The conquests and the conversions and that extraordinary period in history was because they merited it. And at other times of Islamic history, we see other names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala manifested, names of rigor. And there can be times also of qabd, of constriction. And the sign of the true mu'min is that when he is given manifestations of Allah's beauty and grace and generosity, he gives thanks. And when he sees manifestations of the divine rigor, he is patient, he has sabr. And if he is truly one of the khulafa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he has this virtue of rida, which is one of the highest of the prophetic virtues. Now, rida is a Quranic concept, and we can see it in the lives of so many of the great prophetic figures that are held up for our admiration. We see it, for instance, in the story of Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam, who has a life which is a kind of sequence of extraordinary catastrophes followed by amazing unexpected honourings. So that after being the favoured son of a prophet, he is cast into a pit in the desert and apparently has no hope whatsoever. But he has rida. He doesn't complain to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's taken to Egypt, hundreds of miles from his family in the desert, and he's sold into slavery. But he doesn't complain, he accepts Allah's will. And then, وَكَذَلِكَ مَكَّنَّا لِيُوسَفَ فِي الْأَرْضِ, Allah gives Yusuf makana, a standing, a position in the world. And then another calamity befalls him, and he's sent to prison for several years because of a false allegation. And then he comes out again, having had rida and never complained once. And again, the Qur'an says, وَكَذَلِكَ مَكَّنَّا لِيُوسَفَ فِي الْأَرْضِ. And all of that comes, as it were, and the message for us is that if we have rida and serene acceptance, and we don't just panic and bang at the cell doors, screaming to be let out and complaining about our situation, that Allah, in His extraordinary omnipotence and power, can turn our situation over so that from being in the depths of a prison, we become second in command of the most powerful state in the world, which was the position of Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam. It's one of the messages of that story. And also Sayyidina Ayyub alayhi salam, another classic example. وَأَيُّوبَ إِذْ نَادَى رَبَّهُ أَنِّي مَسَّنِيَ الضُّرُّ وَأَنْتَ أَرْحَمُ الرَّاحِمِينَ. It says, and Ayyub, when he said, misfortune has touched me, has come to me, وَأَنْتَ أَرْحَمُ الرَّاحِمِينَ, and you are the most merciful of the merciful. It's not like the biblical book of Job where he kind of gets into an argument and a debate with God saying, is this fair? What do you mean putting me through these misfortunes? No. Sayyidina Ayyub, the real Sayyidina Ayyub alayhi salam, says, this is my situation, وَأَنْتَ أَرْحَمُ الرَّاحِمِينَ. And then Allah takes him out and gives him family and health again.